The knock came at an hour that belonged to neither day nor evening, which was the first unusual thing. The second was the sound itself, too deliberate for maintenance, too patient for trouble. Thomas set down his cooling cup of station-brewed coffee, which had never once in 4 years tasted the way coffee was supposed to taste, and crossed the 6 steps it took to cross his quarters on Drevak Station, which was exactly the kind of living space a man received when his job title contained the word junior, and his ambitions had long since made a quiet peace with modest ceilings. He opened the door expecting a technician with a diagnostic tablet and a problem that belonged to someone else's shift. What he found instead was a woman. She stood in the corridor with the particular stillness of someone who has waited before and found the experience beneath complaint. She was tall, with skin the deep color of cooling embers, a rich, layered crimson that caught the corridor's pale utility lighting and gave it back as something warmer. Her hair was dark and pulled back with a simplicity that managed to suggest it was a choice rather than a convenience. Her ears rose to long, elegant points that curved slightly at their tips, and her eyes, when they met his, were the amber gold of something old and unhurried. She was wearing traveling clothes, plain, well-made, the kind that communicated nothing about the person inside them, which Thomas would later understand had been entirely intentional. She looked at him the way people look at a destination. "Thomas," she said, "not a question." "That depends," he said, because it was late and his coffee was cold and his brain was doing the reasonable thing, which was refusing to process the situation at full capacity. What did he do? Something moved at the corner of her mouth, not quite a smile but the structural foundations of one. "He carried a child out of a burning corridor," she said, 20 years ago, on a station called Kelaris 9. Thomas stood in the doorway, while the silence of the hallway settled around them both, and the distant mechanical hum of Drevak Station continued its indifferent operation. Somewhere 3 corridors away, a pressure relay clicked through its automated cycle. The coffee on his table continued to cool. His mind, which had been moving at the unhurried pace appropriate to a quiet evening, began locating something it had kept stored away without quite knowing it was stored. A corridor full of smoke, emergency lighting the color of old blood, and a small girl sitting very still against a wall while the station came apart around her. He had not thought about it in years. That was not because it had been unimportant. It was because it had felt finished. He had carried her out, handed her to the medics at the evacuation point, and then the chaos of the evacuation had moved him forward and away, the way chaos always does, and Kelaris 9 had been decommissioned 6 months later, and that chapter had simply closed. Apparently it had not. "You'd better come in," he said. "Though I should warn you, the chair on the left has an uneven leg. I keep meaning to fix it." "I'll manage," she said, stepping inside with the ease of someone who had navigated considerably worse than uneven furniture. She told him her name as he moved to the small kitchen unit to put water on for something hot, because it was either that or stand in the middle of the room, feeling the particular vertigo of realizing that your quiet life had just acquired a development. "Valen." She said it simply as though it were only a name, and he repeated it quietly while he found 2 cups that matched, which on Drevak Station was its own small achievement. It was only when he turned back that the rest of it arrived, not dramatically, not all at once, but in the manner of certain recognitions that have been waiting at a patient distance. The eyes were the same. The quality of stillness was the same. The girl in the corridor had been small and frightened and covered in ash, and she had not made a single sound the entire time he carried her, and he had thought at the time that she was in shock. But now, looking at this woman sitting at his unsteady table with the composed certainty of someone who had arrived exactly where they intended, he understood that the silence had perhaps always been simply who she was. "You found me," he said, which was not the most sophisticated thing he had ever said but had the advantage of being accurate. "Eventually," she replied, and the word carried the weight of considerable time and effort delivered with deliberate lightness. You gave no name at the evacuation point. I was 17. I didn't think it would matter. It made things more complicated, she said. And then, with the measured timing of someone who had been quietly funny for a long time without making a performance of it, I found it easier to manage a succession crisis. Thomas sat down in the chair with the uneven leg, because that was simply the kind of evening it was becoming, and looked at her across the small table while the water began to heat, and Drevak Station hummed its ordinary hum around them, entirely indifferent to the fact that something had just shifted. A succession crisis, he said. There were two of them, actually, she said. The second was more interesting. He made tea because the station's coffee had already failed him once this evening, and he saw no reason to compound the situation. It was a simple blend, something dried and vaguely herbal that came in foil packets and claimed on the packaging to promote calm and mental clarity, neither of which Thomas had ever been able to verify. He set the cup in front of her, and she looked at it with the expression of someone who had been served things in rather finer vessels, but was choosing to find this charming instead of noting the difference. She wrapped both hands around the cup. That small gesture undid something in the formality of the moment in a way that Thomas found he was grateful for, because the alternative was sitting across from a woman of extraordinary bearing, in a room where the overhead light had a faint flicker that maintenance had been promising to fix for 6 weeks, and feeling the full absurdity of that contrast without any relief. Tell me about the second one, he said, the more interesting succession crisis. She considered him for a moment before answering, in the way that suggested she was deciding not how much to say, but in which order to say it. Outside, the station's night cycle had shifted the corridor lighting to its dimmer, bluish register, and it came through the narrow viewport beside the door, and added itself to the room's general atmosphere of a conversation happening outside of ordinary time. My eldest sister, Valen began, had the support of the outer councils and a coalition of 3 trade families whose combined fleet tonnage was, I was frequently reminded, considerable. She paused. She also had the advantage of having been prepared for succession since childhood, while I had spent the equivalent years doing other things, such as studying cartography, propulsion theory, languages, a brief pause, looking for a human technician with no recorded name on a decommissioned station's fragmented evacuation manifest. Thomas looked at his tea. I feel like I should apologize for the inconvenience. It was not your fault that Kelaris 9 record systems were damaged in the fire, she said, with the patient generosity of someone who had clearly arrived at this position after a period of feeling differently about it. He asked how she had managed the succession, because it seemed impolite not to, and because he found that he genuinely wanted to know in the way that one wants to understand how a person became who they are sitting across from you. She told him, with the spare economy of someone who has condensed a complicated story through many retellings into its essential shape. There had been a vote among the high chambers that had gone 3 days and required a ruling on a procedural point not invoked in 40 years. There had been negotiations with the trade coalition that she described as lengthy and exhausting and ultimately successful, which she delivered in a tone that suggested the word, exhausting, was doing significant work in that sentence. There had been, at one point, a formal challenge that was resolved through a process she described only as traditional. And when Thomas raised an eyebrow, she added, with perfect composure, that it had involved considerably less violence than the traditional process usually did, which she counted as a personal achievement. And after all that, Thomas said, you went back to looking for me. The search had been running in parallel, she said. I had people working on it during the coalition negotiations. It seemed efficient. But you ran a succession crisis and a missing person search simultaneously. The missing person search was older, she said. I didn't want to deprioritize it simply because something complicated came up. Thomas thought about this. Somewhere in the station's infrastructure, the night cycle's environmental system adjusted the air circulation with a soft mechanical exhale, and the flicker in the overhead light made its irregular appearance and disappeared again. He had lived on Drevak Station for 4 years. He had repaired its conduits and its pressure seals and its ventilation joints, and he knew the sound it made at this hour the way you know the breathing of a place you have slept in long enough. It had always seemed, until approximately 40 minutes ago, like a complete and sufficient world. "How did you find me in the end?" he asked. "A crew manifest from a refueling station near the Calaris corridor," she said. "Cross-referenced against junior technical certifications issued in the right year, filtered by the physical description I had." She paused, and something moved in her expression that was not quite amusement and not quite something else. "You look much the same. I've been told I have an unaging face," Thomas said. "I've never decided if it's a compliment." "It was useful," she said, which was perhaps the most practical compliment he had ever received. He refilled her cup without asking, and she let him, and they sat for a moment in the particular quiet of two people who have covered the necessary ground and arrived somewhere that doesn't yet have a name. The station hummed. The light flickered once and held. Through the narrow viewport, the deep black of the outer corridor offered nothing, which was what viewports on interior quarters always offered, and Thomas had long ago stopped noticing it. But tonight, for some reason, it seemed relevant that the dark was there, and the room was lit, and she was sitting at his table with both hands around a cup of indifferent tea. "You became a queen," he said. It came out with a simplicity that was not quite adequate to the fact. "I did," she said, "and you came here yourself, not an ambassador, not a message." She looked at him steadily. "I wanted to see what kind of person you had become." "And," he said. She considered the question with the genuine seriousness she seemed to give to things that deserved it. "You gave me the chair with the uneven leg," she said, "without noticing. I find that informative." Thomas turned that observation over quietly for a moment, the way you turn something small and unexpectedly weighted in your hands. He had not noticed the chair. That was true. He had sat in it automatically, the way you navigate your own space without seeing it. And she had watched that happen and drawn a conclusion from it. And he found he was not entirely sure what the conclusion was, but that it seemed to matter to her in a way that was worth understanding. "Informative how?" he said. "You didn't perform," she said simply. "People who know who I am perform. They arrange things. They consider which chair to offer and what it communicates." She looked briefly at the cup in her hands. "You made tea from a foil packet and sat in the broken chair without thinking about it. That is a different kind of information." Thomas considered pointing out that he hadn't known who she was when he sat down, but then he considered further and understood that this was precisely the point she was making, and that pointing it out would undermine it. So he said nothing and drank his tea instead, which was the correct response. "How long have you been on Drevak Station?" she asked. 4 years, he said. "Before that, 3 years on a survey vessel running the outer Marin belt. Before that, 2 years on a platform station near Corvith that I don't recommend to anyone." "Why not?" "The gravity calibration was off by 4%, he said. "The entire time. Nobody could fix it because the original installation contractor had used proprietary fittings that required a specific tool that had been discontinued. For 2 years, everyone on that station walked slightly sideways without knowing why they were tired." He paused. "I figured it out in month 19. They thanked me by giving me a certificate." Valen looked at him with an expression that had settled into something warm and specific, the kind of expression that appears on a person's face when something confirms a long-held hypothesis. "A certificate," she said. "Framed," Thomas said. "I left it there when I transferred." She made a sound that was not quite a laugh but was clearly the internal architecture of one, contained and genuine. And he found it was the most human thing about her and simultaneously the most entirely her own. Outside, the station's night cycle continued its slow, automated business. A distant, alert tone sounded 2 corridors away, routine, a pressure sensor completing its scheduled check, and faded, and the quiet returned. "Can I ask you something?" Thomas said. "You've been asking me things for the last hour," she said, which was a reasonable point. "This is a different kind of asking," he said, and she set her cup down slightly and gave him the quality of attention that he was beginning to recognize as her default mode when something interested her, complete, unhurried, and slightly unnerving in its steadiness. "When you were looking for me," he said carefully, "what did you intend to do when you found me, before you found me, when it was still a search and not a conversation?" She was quiet for a moment in a way that felt like honest consideration rather than deflection. Beyond the viewport, a freight carrier was making its slow approach to Drevak's outer dock. He could see its running lights crossing the narrow frame of darkness, amber and white, moving with the patient momentum of something very large that has nowhere urgent to be. "I wanted to tell you that I remembered," she said finally. "That was the original intention. You carried a child out of a burning corridor, and you handed her to the medics, and you didn't give your name, and I wanted the person who did that to know that the child grew up and did not forget." "That's a reasonable thing to want," Thomas said. "The intention changed somewhat over time," she said, in the tone of someone making a careful admission. 20 years is a long time to look for something. The thing you're looking for tends to accumulate meaning while you're looking. Thomas thought about this with the seriousness it deserved. The freight carrier's lights had crossed the viewport and disappeared, and the dark outside had returned to its unremarkable uniformity. He had spent 20 years not thinking about Calaris 9 with any particular frequency, and the asymmetry of that was not lost on him. Not as guilt, exactly, but as the strange geometry of two lives that had intersected for 12 minutes in a burning corridor, and then traveled completely different distances from that point. "I didn't think about it much," he said, "because it seemed important to be honest. I'm not saying that to be unkind. It happened, and it felt like the only available thing to do at the time, and then it was over, and the next thing needed doing." "I know," she said, without any edge in it. "That's one of the things I wanted to understand about you, whether you were someone who thought of it as extraordinary or someone who thought of it as ordinary." She picked up her cup again. "I find the second type considerably more interesting." "I'm not sure I follow the logic," he said. "People who think of it as extraordinary," she said, "did something remarkable and know it. They carry the knowledge with them. It shapes how they see themselves." She considered her tea. People who think of it as ordinary did the same thing and then simply continued, because to them it was not a deviation from their character. It was just their character. Thomas sat with that for a long moment. The overhead light did its flicker. He had, at some point in the last 2 hours, stopped noticing it in the way you stop noticing things that have become part of a moment rather than interruptions of one. "That's a generous interpretation," he said. "It's an accurate one," she said, with the mild firmness of someone who has thought about something long enough to have passed the point of generosity into simple conclusion. "You came a very long way," Thomas said, "to tell a maintenance technician that his ordinary behavior was interesting." "Yes," she said, and the simplicity of it closed the sentence in a way that made it clear she had no difficulty with that fact whatsoever. Thomas got up to refill the water, because it gave him something to do with his hands, which had developed the particular restlessness of hands belonging to a person whose mind is working harder than the surrounding situation visibly requires. He stood at the small kitchen unit and listened to the heating element cycle up and thought about the word ordinary in the specific way you think about a word when someone has just used it to mean something larger than it usually means. He brought the water back and refilled her cup and his own and sat down again, and she thanked him with a small nod that managed to be entirely genuine without being elaborate. And he thought that there was probably a version of this conversation happening in a room with better furniture and properly calibrated lighting somewhere in the universe. And that version had presumably never existed and never would. "Tell me about the station," she said, "what you do here." It was not the question he had expected, which he suspected was intentional. He told her about Drevak, a mid-sized transit station on the outer edge of the Marin corridor, primarily a refueling and cargo transfer point. Population roughly 4,000 if you counted the rotating crew assignments, which Thomas generally did because not counting them made the maintenance load harder to explain to the Resource Allocation Committee. He told her about the work, which was the kind of work that kept large structures from failing quietly and catastrophically, the seams and joints and pressure tolerances that nobody thought about until they stopped functioning, at which point everyone thought about nothing else. She listened with the focused interest of someone for whom this was genuinely new territory, and he found himself talking about it more honestly than he usually did, without the slight apology that tended to creep into his descriptions of his own life when he sensed the person listening expected something more. "You like it," she said when he paused. "I do," he said with a simplicity that matched hers from earlier. "Things break in ways that make sense. You find the fault, you understand it, you repair it. The station functions. There's a satisfaction in that which I've never found to be complicated." "Most satisfactions become complicated eventually," she said, not as a challenge but as an observation from someone with considerable data on the subject. "How long have you been queen?" he asked. 11 years, she said. "Is it satisfying?" She considered the question with the same honest weight she gave everything. "In ways that are extremely complicated," she said. "Yes." Thomas smiled at that, and she saw him smile, and something in the room shifted slightly in the manner of rooms where two people have just crossed from careful to something more comfortable without either of them marking the exact moment of crossing. "What does a queen do?" he said, "when she wants to travel without being a queen?" "She wears plain clothes," Valen said, "and books passage on a commercial carrier under a name that is hers but not her title, and she tells her senior advisor, who is a person of remarkable competence and deeply exhausting foresight, that she is taking a private journey for personal reasons, and her senior advisor looks at her for a long moment and then says, and I am quoting with precision, 'Please send a location ping every 12 hours, or I will notify the outer councils that you've been misplaced.'" Thomas laughed. It was the first full laugh of the evening, and it arrived without warning, and he did not try to moderate it, and she watched it with an expression that was open and pleased in a way that seemed to cost her nothing. "She sounds formidable," he said. "She is the most organized person in any room she enters," Valen said, "including rooms she is not in. I have never been able to explain how this works." "Did you send the pings?" "Every 12 hours," she said, with the slight dignity of someone confirming they are not entirely unreasonable. "I also sent her a message when I arrived at Drevak." "What did it say?" "It said I found him. He makes adequate tea." Thomas looked at his cup. "Adequate," he said. "I was being diplomatic," she said. "She worries." He turned his cup slowly in his hands, a habit he had when thinking, and thought about the shape of what this evening had become. A queen at his unsteady table, drinking foil packet tea, having navigated a commercial carrier and a 20-year search and 2 succession crises to arrive at a maintenance technician's quarters on a mid-tier transit station to have a conversation that neither of them had entirely scripted. There was something about that which defied the category of ordinary, even by the generous definition she had applied to him, and he felt the weight of it not as pressure, but as the particular gravity of moments that announce themselves as significant without requiring you to do anything about it immediately. "Can I ask what you expected?" he said, "when you knocked, what you thought the next hour would look like?" She was quiet in her considering way. A cargo loader in the outer dock made itself audible through the station's hull, a deep, rhythmic vibration that traveled through the walls and the floor and the table between them, and then faded. "I expected it to be shorter," she said. "I expected to say what I came to say, and to see the person, and to have the thing completed." She looked at him with the steadiness he was beginning to find less unnerving and more simply characteristic of her. "I did not expect the chair or the tea or the gravity calibration certificate." The certificate made an impression. "You left it behind," she said. "After 2 years and a genuine discovery, you took nothing for the acknowledgement." She paused. That is extremely consistent with the corridor. Thomas looked at her across the small table and understood that she had been assembling him from fragments for a very long time, and that the person she had assembled and the person sitting in front of her were apparently similar enough that she had not yet looked disappointed. And he found this mattered to him in a way he had not anticipated when he opened the door 2 hours ago, expecting a technician with a diagnostic tablet. The corridor wasn't, he began. If you tell me it was nothing, she said, with a mild precision that carried no sharpness, I will point out that I have spent 11 years as a queen and 20 years before that as someone who was carried out of a fire, and I am therefore reasonably qualified to evaluate what constitutes nothing. Thomas closed his mouth. Good, she said, and picked up her tea. The station's night cycle deepened around them in the way that station nights do, not with darkness, because the corridors outside never went fully dark, but with a quality of quiet that accumulated gradually, the way sediment settles, until the sounds that remained felt deliberate rather than incidental. The cargo loader had finished its work. The pressure sensor in the next corridor had completed its rounds. Drevak Station was doing what it did at this hour, which was function without requiring anyone to notice it, and Thomas, who spent most of his working life ensuring exactly that, found it companionable in a way he had never had cause to share with anyone before. Tell me something about the Vilthari, he said, something that isn't in any reference database. She looked at him with a mild curiosity that suggested the question had surprised her slightly, which he was beginning to understand was not a common occurrence. What makes you think there's something that isn't in the databases? There's always something, he said. Every station I've worked on has an official specification and then the actual thing, and they are related but not identical. I assume civilizations work the same way. She considered him for a moment with the expression of someone revising an estimate upward. We have a ceremony, she said, that is performed on the first night of the cold season, which on our homeworld lasts approximately 4 of your months. Every household, regardless of rank or circumstance, turns off every artificial light source simultaneously for exactly 1 hour. She paused. The entire planet goes dark. Thomas set his cup down. The entire planet. It has been observed without interruption for roughly 900 years, she said, including during the 2 periods of significant civil conflict, which required a specific negotiated ceasefire of 1 hour's duration on the relevant nights. What is it for? Officially, she said, it is a remembrance of a period before our energy infrastructure existed, when the cold season brought genuine hardship. A collective act of humility before what was survived. She looked at her cup with a slight expression that he was learning to read as the preface to something drier than what preceded it. Unofficially, it is the one night of the year when absolutely no administrative work can be transmitted, received, or reasonably expected, because the communications arrays go down with everything else. She paused. I find it the most peaceful night of the year. Thomas laughed quietly. 900 years of bureaucratic ceasefire. My senior advisor suspects this was the original purpose, she said. She has a theory. She has a theory about most things. What's her name? Saren, Valen said, and the word carried a warmth that was different in texture from how she said most things. The warmth of someone who has been genuinely known by another person for a long time and has not taken it for granted. She has been with me since before the first succession question arose. She knew my mother. She has opinions about my sleeping schedule that she delivers with a regularity I have come to find structurally necessary to my existence. She sounds like good infrastructure, Thomas said. Valen looked at him. That is the most accurate description of her anyone has ever produced, she said, with a conviction that suggested she intended to repeat it. The quiet settled again, comfortable now in a way it had not been at the beginning of the evening, when it had been the quiet of 2 people being careful with each other. This was a different quality, the quiet of a conversation that had found its pace, and was no longer concerned about the distance between where it started and where it was. "What happens when you go back?" Thomas asked. It was a question with several layers, and he left them all visible rather than selecting one, because he had the sense she would answer the one that mattered most regardless of which one he technically asked. "There will be a session of the high chambers within the week," she said. "3 infrastructure proposals that require my position before they can advance. A diplomatic correspondence with the Sarath Collective that has been pending for longer than it should have been, which is my fault, because the Sarath Collective's primary ambassador communicates exclusively in a formal register that I find profoundly exhausting." She paused. "And Saren will want a full account of this evening, delivered in sufficient detail to satisfy her, which I estimate will require approximately 2 hours and considerable tea. Will you tell her about the certificate?" "I will tell her everything," Valen said, with the resignation of someone for whom this is not a choice but a condition of the relationship. "She will have opinions. Several of them will be correct, which is the most irritating kind." Thomas nodded slowly. Outside, through the viewport, one of Drevak's outer marker beacons completed its rotation and sent a brief sweep of white light across the corridor wall. A regular, unhurried pulse that had been doing the same thing every 40 seconds for as long as Thomas had lived here, and that he had long since ceased to register as anything other than part of the station's rhythm. Tonight it seemed worth noticing. "I've been thinking about the corridor," he said, "since you mentioned it, since you arrived, really." She waited in her way. "I've been trying to remember if I made a decision," he said, "in the moment. Whether I assessed the situation and chose, or whether I simply moved." He turned his cup in his hands. "I think I simply moved. I saw you and I picked you up, and I moved toward the exit because that was the available direction. I'm not sure there was a decision in the way decisions are usually described." "No," she said quietly. "Does that change anything about the interpretation?" She looked at him with the amber steadiness that he had stopped finding unnerving sometime in the last hour, and had started finding something closer to clarifying. "A person who calculates and then acts generously," she said, "has made a generous calculation. A person who acts generously before the calculation begins has revealed something about what they are made of at the level below calculation." She paused. "I have spent 11 years in rooms full of people making generous calculations. I know what that looks like." She picked up her cup. "You were not calculating." But Thomas sat with this in the same way he sat with things that were true and large, and required the courtesy of not being immediately covered over with words. The beacon light swept the wall again. 40 seconds, reliable, indifferent, continuous. "How long are you on Drevak?" he asked. "I leave tomorrow evening," she said. "There is a carrier departing at the 19th hour that connects at Marin Junction." "That's not very long." "No," she agreed. "Then I'd like to ask," he said, "whether you'd want to walk the station tomorrow, before you leave. I could show you the parts that aren't on any official map. The places where the original construction decisions stopped making sense, and the actual station began." She looked at him across the table, and the something in her expression that had been composed and complete all evening shifted very slightly into something that was those things, and also, beneath them, quietly glad. "I would like that," she said. They met the next morning at the junction between Corridor 7 and the maintenance spine, which was not a location that appeared on any of Drevak Station's public maps, and which Thomas had chosen specifically, because it was the point where the station's original architectural intentions became visibly negotiable. The ceiling dropped by 30 centimeters without explanation. 3 different conduit systems ran parallel in colors that suggested 3 different engineers had worked in the same space across 3 different decades without consulting each other. A pressure housing that had been installed sideways, not incorrectly, but sideways, as though the person responsible had simply preferred that orientation, occupied one wall with the settled confidence of something that had been wrong for so long it had become right. Valen stood in front of the sideways housing for a long moment. "This is intentional," she said. "The function is identical either way," Thomas said. "Whoever installed it knew what they were doing. They just had a perspective." She looked at it with the expression of someone filing information. "My palace has a corridor on the eastern wing," she said, "where the floor heating runs 3 degrees warmer than everywhere else because a repair was made incorrectly during the 2nd year of my mother's reign, and correcting it would require dismantling a wall that now has a significant artwork mounted on it. Everyone who walks that corridor knows. Nobody says anything. We simply walk through it faster." "That's essentially the same problem," Thomas said. "I find that unexpectedly comforting," she said. He took her through the maintenance spine from Junction 7 to the outer cargo ring, which was a walk of about 40 minutes if you moved at a pace that allowed for the station to be observed rather than merely transited. He showed her the place where 2 expansion phases had met in the station's construction history, and left a seam in the floor that was perfectly sealed and completely invisible until the light hit it at the correct angle, at which point it ran the full width of the corridor like a fault line in quiet rock. He showed her the environmental control node that regulated atmosphere for approximately 800 people and occupied a space roughly the size of a storage closet, humming to itself with the modest industry of something that did not require acknowledgement to continue doing its work. He showed her the viewport in Cargo Bay 4 that faced in the direction of the Marin Belt's outer edge, where on clear signal days you could see the drift of ice fragments that had been traveling their slow elliptical route since before the station existed and would continue long after. Indifferent and ancient and faintly luminous in the particular way of things that reflect light they did not generate. She stood at that viewport for longer than she had stood anywhere else. "We have something similar," she said, "in the outer system, a debris field from a collision that happened before we had instruments to record it, so we know it only by what it left behind." She was quiet for a moment. "There is something instructive about things that predate your ability to witness them." "Humbling," Thomas offered. "I was going to say clarifying," she said, "but yes, both." They ate in the station's mid-level common area, which served food that was substantially better than its surroundings suggested, a fact Thomas had discovered in his first month and considered one of Drevak's more reliable qualities. She ate without ceremony and with evident interest, asking him what things were called and trying everything, and he watched her navigate the experience of an ordinary station meal with the same complete attention she brought to everything, and thought that this was probably what she was like in every room she entered, regardless of the room's importance, and that this was both an admirable quality and likely an exhausting one to sustain. "The protein composite," she said, examining it with scientific curiosity, "is attempting to be something. It's attempting to be 3 things simultaneously," Thomas said. "It doesn't fully achieve any of them, but the ambition is there." "I respect the ambition," she said, and ate it. They walked back toward the transit hub through the station's main corridor, which at mid-afternoon was populated with the ordinary traffic of a functioning transit point. Crew rotations, cargo personnel, travelers in transit between other places, people whose relationship with Drevak was temporary and purposeful. Thomas had walked this corridor hundreds of times without thinking about it. Today, he was aware of it as a place, specific and actual, in the way you become aware of the familiar when you are seeing it alongside someone for whom it is new. At the junction before the transit hub, they stopped. The 19th hour was still several hours away, but the shape of the afternoon had the quality of a thing moving toward its conclusion, and both of them understood this without needing to consult the station's time display, which was mounted on the wall above them anyway, and confirmed it regardless. "Saren sent a message this morning," Valen said. "The Sarath ambassador has requested a response by the end of the week. She included a draft. It was extremely good and slightly passive-aggressive, which is her way of indicating that she has been managing the situation longer than she feels is reasonable." "What will you tell her?" "That I'll review it on the carrier," she said. "That I found what I came to find, that the station is more interesting than its designation suggests." She paused. "That the tea was adequate." "Still adequate," Thomas said. "I've decided to be consistent," she said. He looked at her in the corridor's standard lighting, which was neither flattering nor unkind, and thought about the girl in the smoke who had not made a sound, and the woman who had spent 20 years in 2 succession crises, finding her way to a junction outside Corridor 7. And the distance between those 2 points seemed both enormous and, somehow, exactly the right length for the story they had apparently been in together without knowing it. "I want to ask something," he said, "and I want you to know that the question exists independently of whatever the answer is. It's a genuine question, not a preamble to anything." "Ask it," she said. "Was this enough?" he said, "coming here? Finding me? The conversation, the walk, the ambiguous protein composite. Is the thing you were carrying for 20 years, is it lighter now?" She was quiet in her considering way, and the corridor moved around them with its ordinary business, and somewhere in the station's infrastructure a ventilation cycle shifted, and the air changed by a fraction of a degree in the way it did at this hour, which Thomas noticed automatically because he always did. "Yes," she said, and then after a moment with the precision that was entirely her own, "and heavier, but differently. The weight has changed its character." Thomas nodded, because he understood this to be the most honest answer available, and it deserved acknowledgement rather than resolution. "Come back," he said. "When the Sarath correspondence is finished and the chambers have voted and Saren has had her 2 hours, come back and I'll show you the secondary maintenance level, which is stranger than everything you saw today and which I have been saving without knowing I was saving it." She looked at him with the amber steadiness, and beneath it, visible now, the something that had been quietly glad last night and was quietly glad still, and he understood that this was not a small thing for her to show and that she was showing it anyway, which was its own kind of information. "I'll send the location pings," she said. "Every 12 hours, he said. "Every 12 hours, she agreed. She left at the 19th hour on a commercial carrier that was neither large nor small, the kind of vessel that moved through the Marin corridor with the practical anonymity of things that did not require anyone to look twice. Thomas stood at the observation window of Drevak's transit hub and watched the docking clamps release, and the carrier ease out into the dark with the patient, unhurried momentum of something that knew where it was going. He stood there until the running lights had reduced to points, and then to nothing, and then he turned and walked back through the station he had maintained for 4 years. Through the corridors he knew by their sounds and their faults and their sideways pressure housings and their 3-degree warm patches, and he understood that the station was the same, and he was not exactly, in the way that things are never exactly the same after a night and a morning that have rearranged something below the level of the visible. He went back to work. A pressure seal in Cargo Bay 3 needed inspection. The flickering light in his quarters still needed fixing, and he thought that this time he might actually fix it. He took the long route through Corridor 7, past the junction where the ceiling dropped without explanation, and he did not walk through it faster.